And welcome to today's STN July webinar. This session is being recorded so that it can be offered as an on-demand CE for our members. Your lines are muted, so if you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question queue, and as many will be answered at the end of the presentation, time permitting. STN is an accredited provider of continuing nursing education. To claim CE for this session, you must attend the entire session and complete the online evaluation for the presentation. If you are attending this webinar live, you will receive an email shortly after the conclusion of the presentation with directions to complete the evaluation. Certificates will be emailed approximately 7 to 14 days after today's event. If you are viewing this session as a recorded on-demand CE, you will be able to download your certificate after completing the quiz and the evaluation. Today's session is interactive and will include several online polls. We hope that you gain great value from this educational session. Today's speaker is Amy Krichten, who serves as the Director of Accreditation for the Pennsylvania Trauma Systems Foundation. Prior to this, Amy served as a Trauma Program Manager for Wellspan Health York Hospital, a Level 1 trauma center. She has been a consultant and site surveyor for the state trauma systems and has spent her 20-plus years of nursing in the trauma spectrum. She graduated from Lancaster General Hospital School of Nursing and received her BSN from Regis University in Denver, Colorado. Amy is currently the co-chair of the STN Leadership Committee and is faculty for the STN topic course. In addition, Amy is an ATC instructor and a certified emergency room nurse. Please welcome Amy Krichten.
Hello, everybody, and good afternoon. Welcome to the PowerPoint presentation of the effective methods to demonstrate trauma performance improvement activities. You should be able to see the slides on your screen right now, and as we continue to go through the presentation, like Cody said, if you have any questions, feel free to enter them in the chat session, and we'll get to those as time permits. The learning objectives of this afternoon's presentation are to review some PowerPoint and general presentation guiding principles, to explore data demonstration options, and then to apply those concepts to common trauma performance improvement topics. I have nothing to disclose, no conflict of interest relative to this educational activity. As Cody said, this is an accredited continuing nursing education presentation. You will be awarded 1.0 contact hours after this, and you'll receive an email following the presentation with instructions on how to receive those. Successful completion, you must participate in the entire course and fill in the evaluation at the end. So we're going to start with our first interactive audience poll. You should be able to see it on your screen, and it's a simple question of, have you ever developed a PowerPoint presentation from the beginning? From scratch? Have you ever had to do one from point blank, empty slides, and go forward? So you should be able to answer yes or no in your poll. And Cody, you should be able to see those.
I do. We're about 90%, so I'm going to give it a few more seconds to let everybody answer. Okay, that concludes the first poll. 96% said yes, while 4% said no, and we had about 90% answer rate.
Excellent. We're gonna use that as we work through the presentation to hopefully point out some tips and tricks for you for those who have used PowerPoint before, and to hopefully give you some new tips for those of you who have not used it. Our second interactive audience poll is how often, for those of you who are using PowerPoint, how often in your trauma role do you use a PowerPoint presentation? The choices are daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, or never. So in your trauma role, how often must you use a PowerPoint presentation? The answers are coming in.
We'll give them about 5 more seconds or so.
Okay.
Okay, thank you everybody who participated in that poll. 1% said daily, 23% said weekly, 62% said monthly, 10% said yearly, and 4% said never.
Okay. So those of you who use it frequently or who have used it before, you're joining many of your fellow colleagues who use PowerPoint presentations. PowerPoint was originally originated in 1984. It originally came out just for Apple and Macintosh users, and then in 1990 was developed into the Microsoft family and became the product that we know today. Today there are actually more than 500 million users who are using a PowerPoint presentation, so we're not alone in our trauma role in using this tool. And according to PowerPoint, there are more than 30 million new presentations created every day. With the PowerPoint toolkit, though, there's a new phrase that's actually coined by Garber in 2001 called death by PowerPoint. You can actually overdo PowerPoint and have so many bells and whistles in a presentation that you lose your point of your message. And so what we have to decide as users of the program, is it a blessing or a curse? And how can we use it to be powerful and engaging, but not be too simplistic and not misleading to conclusions for the audience? So I'm hopefully going to give you some points and tips to set up presentations in general, and then we're going to switch it over and focus on some of the trauma points to a PowerPoint presentation. So the basic PowerPoint tips are on the screen for you here, and they're to know certain things about your presentation in general. The first one is, what's the purpose? Are you there to teach people a new concept? Are you there to just review things? You have to know the setting. Are you going to be in a huge auditorium? Are you in a small conference room with only 10 people? You have to know these facts ahead of time, even before you start preparing your presentation, because it'll help you guide the content of what you're going to put into it. Definitely need to know the audience. Are you speaking to the C-suite and have to have a message geared towards that education level? Or are you dealing with group of EMS providers, for example, who have bring a different set of skill sets into the table, and you need to gear things towards what they want to hear. So you have to know who you're speaking to. You definitely need to know your time frame of how long you're allowed to speak. That can be a blessing or a curse as well. It's never good to have a 45-minute presentation, but prepare an hour and a half worth of information. That will frustrate you as a presenter, as well as the people who are listening to your presentation. They might feel cheated out, if you will, of some of your knowledge. But it's also just as equally frustrating to go or to even pay for a presentation where they promised you 45 minutes or 60 minutes of information, and to be a speed speaker and get through the information in 20 minutes, and then you have to fill up the rest of your time with something. So you need to know the time frame that you're allotted for your presentation, and make sure you have enough information to fill it adequately, but not overfill it. The next basic presentation point is to know your equipment. Go early. Use your microphone. Hook it up to you. If you're using a microphone, put it on. Know if you're going to be standing at a podium. Some of us are podium grabbers and cling to the podium as our safety net. Some of you prefer to walk around the room, walk in the front of the room. Whatever you're going to do, it's best if you go early, and if you can, practice your presentation a few times to make sure that everybody in the room can hear you, especially if you're in a large room. I really recommend you put your PowerPoint presentation up on a large screen. Things can definitely look distorted on a large screen, so you want to make sure that the information you have ready to project looks presentable to the audience. So go early and practice. An example of that is Cody and I got on the call today about 30 minutes early just to pull these PowerPoint slides up for you all and make sure that they present well. And it gives you a chance to work with your equipment. One of the biggest pieces of equipment that people forget to look at is just simply how to advance your slides. Think of the number of times you go to a PowerPoint presentation and somebody is at the podium and they say, I don't know how to get to the next slide, what do I do here? That adds a glimmer into doubting someone's competence, and you want to make sure that you're ready from the get-go to present with that confidence so that you don't lose your audience in the beginning. So check that equipment. It's very, very important. And check your slide order. Go through the practice mode, like I said. Your opening presentation, your opening few words of any presentation set the stage for your success. So it's important that when you get to the podium or when you get to the front of the table or when all eyes are on you, that you're ready to go. So it's worth the extra time to prepare ahead of time. More basic PowerPoint tips. As you're preparing your slides, I said you need to have the right amount of slides for the volume of time. You should try to prepare 1 to 2 slides per minute of your presentation. For example, today is a 60-minute presentation. I have 75 slides on here. Again, practice with your slides so you know if you have enough to fill the amount of time. You don't want to go over or you don't want to go under. The next bullet point is that you should write in short point form, and there's a 6x6 rule when you're dealing with PowerPoint. That is, you should not have more than 6 bullets on a slide and not more than 6 words behind each bullet. That can be very hard to do. You should try to paraphrase things into comments and not have more than 6 words behind a bullet point and then speak to those words. So just as I had several sentences there about 6x6, I didn't write all those out for you. Paraphrase and then speak to them. The third bullet point is limit your punctuation. The brain automatically stops at the end of a line. You don't need to put a period behind each of these bullets. You can see there's no punctuation behind those. You don't need it. It's extra. It's more information for your brain to have to process as it looks at a slide. So recommendations are to limit your punctuation to only where necessary. And the last slide, and one that I think is very important, is the 7-second rule. PowerPoint speaks to the fact that an average human being, when they're looking at a PowerPoint slide, looks at it and gets the information in an average of 7 seconds or less. I joke when I give this presentation and tell people for your trauma surgeon it's probably more like 4 or 5 seconds, and everybody else is about 7 seconds. Some people it may take longer, but the average is 7 seconds. So you have 7 seconds once your slide gets presented for the people to look at it, get the information, and then their brain is ready to move on to the next thing. So you want to make sure that the points that you put behind a bullet point are important and are the key points that you want to get across to your audience. This is an example of a trip up or something that you don't want to do in a PowerPoint presentation. So this long sentence says this page contains too many words for a presentation slide. It's not written in point form, making it difficult for you and your audience to read and for you to present. Although they're exactly the same number of points as the previous slide, it looks much more complicated and short. You're on so la 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 la. That's exactly what I'm trying to get at. 6 points, no more than 6 words behind each point. And don't read your slides. You want to put your paraphrase points behind your bullets and then speak to them, but don't read. There's nothing worse than death by PowerPoint from someone reading the slides to you. More basic PowerPoint tips. You should, oops, we're going the wrong way there. There we go. Let's talk about fonts. So there's different styles of fonts. You should avoid very narrow fonts or fancy fonts. The rule of thumb is that for every 1-inch letter on the screen, you can see that from 10 feet away. So this is, again, something you want to put up on your screen in your presentation room where you're giving your PowerPoint presentation so you can make sure even the people in the back of the room can see your font size. The acronym KISS stands for Keep It Short and Simple, and KILL stands for Keep It Large and Legible. So you want it to be able to be viewed and understood from everywhere around the room. And again, the best way to know if that's going to work, if your font is going to work, is to go and pull it up on your screen ahead of time and make sure you're prepared that way. Also with fonts, you should use different size fonts for your main points and then for your secondary points and tertiary points. So the nice thing about PowerPoint templates is it does this automatically for you. The first line of use different size fonts for main points is in a 32 font. The next one's 28, 24, and then it continues to go down and so forth. You should avoid all capitalization when you're putting a bullet point in, just like common text or email courtesy capitalization insinuates that you're yelling or trying to get a point across. It does work if you're trying to get a point, something that's very important. You can also underline. However, it's difficult to read the font when it's in all capitalization, so you should avoid that. And then avoid bold and complicated fonts like the last bullet there, because that's also difficult to read. Your fonts will also just portray a message, let alone the words that you want to say with them, but how they project on the screen. You should utilize that same size font throughout your presentation unless you're doing the bullet points subdivisions like we talked about before. The font of Comic Sans tends to be too casual. It's like it says, it's a comic. It tends to be casual, and that's appropriate if your venue and your audience is looking for a casual message. It's okay to use that if that's what you're doing. If you're talking to the C-suite about important details, it's not recommended to use that. The third bullet there talks about script font, and you can see that that's just very difficult to read. Although it gives you the message that it's a formal presentation, it is very hard to read that. And the bottom font there about Times New Roman, Tahoma, and Arial, they're the most common fonts that you'll see in PowerPoint presentations. Times New Roman, according to the PowerPoint website, is used really about 70% of the time in presentations. It is statistically the one that's accepted most in professional publications as well. So if all else fails, pick Times New Roman and you should be good to go. You can also pick fonts to go with your color. So the first bullet there, although it's hard to say, says using a font that does not contrast with the background is hard to read. Obviously, you need to make sure you see that on the screen. Different bulbs in LCD projectors actually will portray colors differently on the screen. So again, when you're going ahead and practicing ahead of time, make sure that your fonts look like they do on the computer screen in front of you the same way on the big screen for your presentation. The second bullet about using color for font and decoration, that's just annoying and you should never do that. And the last one says you should never use a different color for each point. It's just not necessary. The subdividing, indenting, and changing the font size will work, but you don't need to change it for a different color. Regarding bullets themselves, you should pick one bullet and stick with it throughout your presentation. Again, a template in Microsoft PowerPoint will do this for you. The traditional dot bullet, as in the first line there, is the one that is most often utilized. Check marks tend to indicate a step in a process. So they're good if you're saying do this and then that and then that, or if you're trying to say we've done these but we haven't done this part of the list, for example. Fancy bullets like the diamond configuration there can be distracting. It's extra information for your brain to have to process. And the silly bullet there on the bottom, that's just silly and it's not recommended that you use things. Again, that's extra information. If you only have 4 to 7 seconds for people to get a concept, you don't want them to be focusing on what does that bullet mean. You want them to focus on what's your message. So pick a bullet, stick with it, and simple is best. When you're picking colors in general for your presentation, you know that there's a concept of complementary color scheme. So blues and orange, for example, in the color wheel there go together. Again, most PowerPoint templates will pick colors that are complementary for you to use. The STN PowerPoint that we're looking at now focuses on the maroon color for the words to go with the maroon line on the bottom of the screen. That works well together. Complementary colors can actually, studies have shown, will affect your brain and interpretation of material. So if you want to get your best foot forward and have your best chance that your material will be understood and successful, make sure you're picking colors that go well together. You also need to remember that colors mean things. So like the stoplight there, if I present something in a color red, your body is taught to know that red is traditionally bad or stop, yellow is caution, green traditionally means go and good. So you want to remember that as you're going through presentations, putting charts together, for example, that your mind associates green with good. You want to make sure that if you're labeling things with colors that they're making sense. So here's a thing that's telling you that you have 70 blue pens and 30 red pens, but the key for this slide doesn't match up. So you need to make sure if you're truly talking about colors and results that you proofread your work and that they make sense to the presentation. Here's a great example of how you can use that color to emphasize. So this is a graph showing your trauma M&M meeting attendance and the participation at that meeting. And you can look quickly, and I would say probably 2 seconds, and know that trauma attendance is good and neuro attendance, as represented by red, is bad. So that's a great example of how you can highlight things that you want someone to focus on, get to quickly, and get that powerful information just from looking at a color association with it. You should avoid excessive art when you're doing a PowerPoint presentation. If I'm trying to tell you that I'm happy today, I don't need 8 ways to tell you that I'm happy. Pick one and go with it. Make sure that you look at the PowerPoint clip art that you pick on a screen as well. Sometimes they can come up on a screen and look distorted and not clear. Even if they look normal on your computer screen in front of you, on a big screen in a room, they may be distorted, and that would be distracting, so you don't want to do that. Also, you need to be purposeful when you're inserting art. You see how this koala bear up here is over the words of the title. That's a no-no. You want to make sure that your art is not covering up words, because now people are trying to figure out what are the words underneath here, and they're not listening to what I'm saying. You want to make sure that those pictures are in focus and facing towards the text. See how my koala bear, again, is facing towards the text on the left. That draws your eye naturally. You're going to look at the koala bear first and then go to the left and read the text. So face your art towards the text if you can. The next one says avoid clip art with action. This heart rate monitor that I have on here is nice and it's cute, but it's distracting. And you don't need that extra stimulus when you're going through a PowerPoint presentation. So I would advise you to avoid action clip art. Don't place them over the words. We talked about that. When you're using a video like we have here, you want to make sure that your video runs and clicks when you, let me go back there, when you click on it. You don't want your video to start right away while you're talking, because people will start to look at your video and listen to your video and not focus on what you're saying. And practice that when you're doing a presentation so you know that it works, and it works when you click it. You should try to avoid distracting art. This is an example of a very nice graph which talks about the price of a 1 carat diamond. But because of the art that was picked with the graph, it adds a little humor to the situation. And traditionally, when you're talking to the C-suite, they don't want to see this kind of humor. So pick appropriate art when you're putting it in there. Don't use a distracting background on a PowerPoint presentation. If you put a picture like this up here, people are now looking through the picture to see if they're on it or if they recognize anyone in it and try to figure out what the event was. So it's recommended that you don't use a distracting background. To that vein, it's best if you pick a background that is simple. The colored backgrounds that are within the red circle here are great examples of simple, plain backgrounds. When you pick one of those, you want to be consistent. You should use the same background for all of your slides. The 3 slides on the right there are a little busy and not recommended because there's too much to look at there. There's too much for your brain to process that and additional words and messages on top of it. So pick a consistent background that's simple and easy. If you go on to the Microsoft website and PowerPoint in particular, there are literally thousands and thousands of backgrounds that you can pick from. Too many people spend so many hours looking at all the backgrounds and trying to pick one, and that's unnecessary. Pick something that's simple, be consistent. The next part, we're going to talk about transitions. You should avoid transitions as they can be distracting and can make it difficult for you to receive the message and, quite frankly, can be incredibly obnoxious. So avoid transitions when you're going through a PowerPoint presentation. Again, per the website, there are over 100 different options for transitions, for words to fly in and fade in and fade out, and even for your slides in general, not just the words, but your slides in general to fade in and out. Again, that's all distracting and extra fluff that you don't need in a good presentation. Proofread and spell check your PowerPoint presentations. Can't stress this enough. I consider myself one of the world's worst spellers, so I always push the spell check button on all of my documents and give my PowerPoint presentation to a neutral party to look at it for spell checking and grammar errors. Sometimes you can get so close with your information that you just read over a spelling error or perhaps a misplaced word because you're just so used to what you're trying to say. So having an independent reviewer look at your information is so valuable. You really lose credibility, and it's distracting when you have spelling errors. So you remember before we talked about punctuation and how I said you don't need punctuation at the end of sentences. But here's the example of when punctuation is important. This sentence says, a woman without her man is nothing. This sentence says, a woman without her man is nothing. And this sentence says, a woman without her man is nothing. Now, I'm not going to waste time in a presentation to tell you which one of those is correct. But if you want to get the right information out to your audience in a situation like this, you do need punctuation. You can see in all three of those situations, I didn't put a period at the end, but the punctuation in the middle is very important because it changes the message. And again, this is something that if you're the presenter, you might not pick up on this because you know the way you want it to sound in your head, but someone external looking at your presentation will pick that up and notice that you need some explanation there. So having an independent reviewer is recommended. So if we switch from the general PowerPoint presentation guiding principles and talk more about data and how to manage your data, we have to all agree, first of all, that data is power. You know that, especially in today's time, that people want to see the numbers to back up what you're saying. And the old phrase that numbers don't lie, and the data is power. So you need to make sure that you have good data, especially clean data. You don't want data with errors. There's a lot of research and publications out there on trying to do service recovery, if you will, if you put out a presentation with the wrong information on it. The amount of time that you will have to do to correct information if you give out bad data is incredible. And the amount of time that you as a presenter need to work on your own credibility, again, if it gets out that you presented wrong data once, you kind of lose that credibility factor. And so that will take you additional time to recoup that. So you have to make sure your data is clean in the front end. The bullets that talks about clarifying measurements and definitions. Remember that as you look at certain data points or graphs as we look in the rest of this presentation, you have to make sure that your audience is all speaking the same language. The one that comes to my mind is pneumonia. We all know that pneumonia is one thing to trauma. It's one thing to the ventilator-associated people in your hospital. It's another thing to NISQIP and TQIP and all different layers of definition of what pneumonia is. So if you're putting a pneumonia statistical rate out there on your presentation, you have to make sure that everybody understands your definition of what you're referring to and make sure that your measurements are clear. And I'll give you some examples of that in just a few minutes. And then the last thing is drilling down to eliminating outliers or variances. We're going to talk about how you can do that in a data set, and I will give you examples of that as well. So on your screen are three different types of graphs that are available to present information: a bar graph, a circle or a pie graph, and a line graph. All three of these graphs are, again, showing the exact same information. But when your brain interprets them, it's easier to interpret information on different kinds of graphs. And the trick is to pick which graph is appropriate for the message that you're trying to portray to your audience. So all three of these are talking about chocolate milk and the chocolate milk that is sold per day. And if I would tell you, if you're looking at these three graphs right now, which one is the easiest to tell which day you sold the most chocolate milk on, most of us would say this bar graph, because it's easy to look across very quickly and know that this is higher than the rest of them. So Wednesday we sold the most. Presenting that data in a pie or a circle graph like this, your brain actually has to look at these and make sure that this one is bigger, and then figure out, oh, that's Wednesday. And a line graph talks more about relations, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. Another kind of way you can list information is a list or a table. If you're using a list or a table, you're listing data that has no relationship to anything else other than to the whole. So the first list there is talking about your 5th grade class pizza survey. 10 children liked pepperoni, 9 liked sausage, and 7 liked cheese. That's just relationship to the whole. That's the numbers simply listed out. The table on the bottom is talking about, again, our red and blue pens and numbers sold in quarters. And again, it's just listing out numbers. You're not comparing anything there. You're just listing them out. Again, a list or a table works well if you're just listing simple information or bullet points. But it doesn't work well if you're trying to compare items. So use a list or a table for simple outcome results. A bar graph, however, works very well if you're trying to compare results. So again, here's your same thing, type of pizza, pepperoni, sausage, and cheese, and you can see very easily which one's the most there, pepperoni in that slide. The next one over talks about the January, February, March penetrating and blunt trauma. That's a great way to compare two separate categories, again, over a month. So a bar graph is better when you're trying to do a quick comparison of information, and you can do horizontal or vertical bars here. There's not one that's better or worse than another. It's just typically your eye reads from left to right. So the January, February, March, going left to right is easier for a person to interpret than if you would use a vertical bar graph. This slide demonstrates the importance of scales. You need to make sure, based on the information or the message, if you will, that you're trying to give to your audience about the scale that you pick. So the bar graph on the left there talks about your number of transfer ins per year. And with the lines behind it, you can see you could take a simple message from this that they have been gradually increasing. This bar graph on the right is showing the exact same information, the exact same numbers, but the scale is different. And the message that you get from this graph is that you really jumped up in between the years, as opposed to the gradual increase message that you got from this one. So a nice feature in PowerPoint is a graph button that's on the top of each outline for PowerPoint, and you can put your graph in there and then play with the scales to get the right message for your audience. So you need to figure out, what am I trying to say? Am I trying to say we've gradually increased over the years, or am I trying to say we really increased each year? And then pick the graph that best matches the message that you're trying to portray to your audience. This graph is showing you too much can be too much. Again, PowerPoint will tell you there's over 1,000 different options for a single bar graph on backgrounds and colors and scales and so forth and so on. Too much is too much. That somebody is going to look at this slide and turn away because it makes them sick. So don't even go overboard in graphs. The simpler, the more simplistic, the better, because then people will focus on your message and not on your artistic ability. Column placement in a graph is also important. Now, before we talked about the months or the days of the week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, you can't really adjust those columns because they're in a sequence. But this is a bar graph showing you how kids get to school. And if I put the bar graph on the left on the screen by itself, your brain needs to take an extra second to interpret that, to know that walking, for example, is the second to the highest. It has to read through all of these options to look for the right answer. The bar graph on the right is the same data, just presented in sequential order. So it's easy to look at the bar graph on the right and know that walking is the second to the highest. because your brain does not have to interpret all the other choices and put them in order. So it's recommended, again, that you put them in order when you can. So you can't always do that. If you're doing a time or a month, for example, you can't do that, but put them in order. And then you have to take it one step further to determine, are you trying to get your point across for this slide, for example? Are you trying to get your point across that school buses are really used a lot? Or are you trying to get your point across that cars are rarely used? Whichever one you want to get the point to the most, you should put that one first. Oh, let me go back there. Sorry about that. So in this slide, you want people to get the fact that the school bus is the most, so I put that first. If I wanted people to know that very few people were did cars, I would just flip the order and do car, cycle, public, walk, school bus. Put whatever you're going to do first from left to right, because that's the way you normally read a document. Here's a silly slide that talks about how you can be creative with your column placement, especially if you're using an extension of the finger used in management. Again, not recommended for the C-suite if you like your job. Here is a chart that shows trauma council attendance over a 12-month period. It's a great chart. A lot of people use this. I believe this is from a recent topic course that gives you an example of where your benchmark is and where your providers are falling on the grid. My comment to this chart is just, remember before we said green is good, yellow is caution, and red is bad? If our benchmark is 50%, I would push it one more step to put those zeros and the 40 and the 50% in red so that they stand out. And if you really want to embarrass your ophthalmology, vascular, OMFS, and transfusion, put their name in red too. Even put their whole line in red. If you're trying to get a point across that this is not what you want, make it stand out so that they can really get the point and there's no confusion or opportunity to misinterpret that is bad. I will tell you that we've used this in several programs. It works well for those of you who are having trouble shaming people into attending your M&M. This is a great way. Put this on your screen in your M&M room before your meeting starts, so as the providers walk in the room, they see it face up right up there, and they can hold themselves accountable. So it's the same kind of chart, percent compliance. The arrow shows exactly where you want to be. Just the same information, just presented a little bit differently. Works really well to help shame providers into attendance if you need help with that. So if we switch from bar graphs and go to line graphs now, this is an example of the line graph for chocolate milk. Again, over time, we can't really change up the order of Monday through Friday because that's a sequential order that we go with every day. But the nice thing about a line graph is you can draw a conclusion to the audience by connecting your dots. So if I put this chart up there, you not only know that Thursday we sold the most, but that also every day until Thursday we sold more, and then it really dropped off on Friday. So when you use a line graph, that's more of a relationship between items, and the relationship of that over time is when you want to use a line graph. You can also show cause and effect really well when you use a line graph. So this is a graph showing your PowerPoint knowledge level and the intervention of my awesome presentation today and the timing of when that happened and your comfort level with PowerPoint. So this is great to show a survey team or a C-suite because it points out this is where we did our intervention and this is when things improved. This is also a great way to make sure if your data leaves your presentation that somebody can see this and know that it's because of something you did or that intervention step that made the improvement happen. So line graphs are great to show a relationship over time and to point out interventions in that relationship. This is an example of a control chart. It's a form of a line chart. And the nice thing with control charts is you get the black solid line in the middle there that shows a trend. This is a great thing to do for people who are mathematically challenged who have trouble telling if this blue line is getting better or getting worse. By putting the trend line in there, you can see it's gradually going up. And in this case, we're talking about a ventilator-associated pneumonia rate, so that's bad. but you can see the trend is actually going up. Even though these last 2 data points, 3 data points altogether, are going down, the trend is going up. The other nice thing in a control chart is you can put in several rates at one time and do a comparison. So this is showing a pink rate versus a blue rate, and those you would label different types of definitions, for example. And then again, add your trend line in there. And PowerPoint or Excel, depending on what you're using, will put a trend line in automatically for you. So use those if you want to help people to show a relationship over time as well. This is a benchmarking report that some of you may be familiar with. It's an old TQIP report that they used to show. We're not going to spend much time talking about this. All I want to tell you is that when you put a chart out like this for public digestion, if you will, you need to give a lot of explanation with it, because people traditionally are not used to looking at a presentation like this. They're used to seeing some bar graphs and pie graphs and stuff like that, but if you put something like this out there, this is foreign to a lot of people. And so sometimes when I'm talking to a graph like this, I'll actually put bullet points on the left of how to read this graph. In case it gets out of your PowerPoint presentation, people will understand what they're seeing. Again, a graph like this takes a lot of explanation so that you can make sure your audience completely understands it. This is a scatter plot. A scatter plot chart demonstrates points over relationship to events. The scatter plots can be good, but they can also be confusing. Again, it's an option when you're using Excel or PowerPoint to do anything with that you have multiple points on. I would tell you at first look on this scatter plot is too busy. You can't tell any of these independent points that are in this big blob on the left here. However, you do get the message from this slide that there are a lot of points. So if I'm telling you that this slide, for example, is showing people who are late to class, at least you won't know who all of these individual people are. You can't tell me that there's 800 people in there, but you can tell me that there's a lot of people who are late to class, for example. So if you're trying to get a point that there are a lot in a point, a scatter plot will work. Again, not everybody's comfortable using this chart, this type of chart, so I would tell you if you're going to use it, you want to make sure you give some explanation to it and fully define your points. Pie charts, pie that I've eaten, pie that I have not yet eaten. We all kind of get that. That's a silly slide. But this is a simple pie chart. This is showing you trauma volume by mechanism. Here you can see fall, motor vehicle, motorcycle, and assault that are in there. Couple notes to this, the colors that you see there are complementary colors that were picked by PowerPoint. So that's nice. They're not meant to be indicative of positives or negatives. They're just individual points. The other thing that you notice on a chart like this is sometimes you have a reference point to what each color means, and sometimes you don't. That's called a legend. Some charts will have a legend, some don't. I'll tell you, if you can label each piece of your pie, like we have here, you don't need a legend. Having the labels right on top of your pie slices, if you will, allows your brain to quickly interpret what that slice of pie is. I can look at this red, see motor vehicle collisions 22%. I don't have to go to the side and interpret what red is. So if you have big chunks of pie and you can put your labels right on your pie, go ahead and do that. That works really well. Again, you want to make sure that the parts of your pie total 100. You don't ever want to have 2 slices of pie and say we're talking about 3 types of people in the world, for example. And when the graph before it, some of you who are really big math whizzes probably went through and added 58, 22, 13, and 7 to make sure I add up to 100. Those total have to be 100 because with the pie chart, you're looking at the relationship to a whole. Now this is a pie chart, again, that's really busy. You can't tell me what this green color here, for example, what country that green color is. So I would tell you that this is not an effective pie chart. However, if I'm trying to tell you that there are a lot of countries involved in this project, you definitely get that message because of all of those individual slices. A better way to present this might be to take everything from here, this whole section, and potentially label that other, for example. so that you can get them all together. However, if I would put other in there, you can't tell how many truly there are. So you want to make sure that your message matches your intention if you're using a pie graph. So if I give you a graph like this, I'm going to show you the importance of using a value in a pie graph. This is a chart showing you the drivers from Neverland that were involved in a motor vehicle collision. And I'm telling you that the blue is the men and the maroon is the women. This is a great example of, I have plenty of room on my pie here to label these. It would be better to put the men right in the blue and the women on the red so that you don't have to take your extra second of your glorious 6 seconds to try to interpret that. However, on this slide, if I just present this data to the public and say, this is the drivers from Neverland involved in a fatal motor vehicle crash, that's not enough information. This is an example of the importance of values. For example, what if I told you the total number of fatalities in Neverland for the year was 100, 75 are men, 25 are women? Then you can assume from that information that men are worse drivers than women. But what if I told you the whole population of Neverland was 1,000, and 975 of the 1,000 people in Neverland were men and 25 were women, but all 25 of those women died? Now women are the worst drivers. So this is an example of how just having data face up is not enough. And you need to make sure you give your audience all the background of the components of your puzzle in order for them to be able to make an appropriate and accurate conclusion. Data without good labels can be very distracting and misleading. So now we're going to change focus to talk about putting this data points out there in a positive light. So you've heard about, is your glass half full or half empty? Technically, according to this slide, it's 100% full. It's full with air and water. But it's much better when you're presenting data to talk about an accuracy rate versus an error rate. So talk about your positives, accentuate your positives, and if you're saying you're 91% accurate, that's much better than saying you have a 9% error rate. So here's our next interactive poll. This is a standard for your trauma surgeon. Arrival time at your trauma activations is within 15 minutes. Which one is presented in a positive light? To say Dr. Jones arrived on time 113 out of 130 activations. To say Dr. Jones was 13% non-compliant, or to say Dr. Jones was 87% compliance. Which one is it presented in a positive light? A few more seconds to allow people to answer. Of which one of the following is presented in a positive light? Dr. Jones arrived on time, 113 out of 130. Dr. Jones was 13% compliant, or he was 87% compliant.
Okay, we had about 80% respond, so I'll go ahead and read the results for you. 20% said Dr. Jones arrived on time, 113 out of 130 activations. Nobody thought that Dr. Jones was 13% non-compliant, and 80% believed Dr. Jones was 87% compliant.
Excellent. Thank you, Cody. So what I would say is that definitely the second choice there is not positive. The top one of Dr. Jones on time, 113 out of 130, is good. However, it requires some math to it. You have to figure out if that meets your benchmark of 80% of the time. And off the top of your head, it's hard to do that math of 113 divided by 130. Dr. Jones compliant 87% of the time is a great way to present that. However, if you want the full picture for your C-suite, the line, which I didn't give you an option of, was Dr. Jones arrived within 15 minutes of patient arrival 113 out of 130 times, or 87%. Minimal compliance is 80%. Good for Dr. Jones. So give all of the data points with it, present it in a positive fashion instead of saying he was non-compliant 13% of the time and moving on. Give him kudos for the fact that he did arrive on time. I put this slide in here not really to give you new points, but because it's hard when you're giving a webinar. I can't see anybody and know if you're sleeping, and knowing that we just dropped down to 80% on the interactive poll. But this just reminds you, as a speaker, you need to evaluate your audience as you're going through a presentation. Are they engaged in what you're presenting or what you're talking about? This is a big controversy about using electronic devices. Sometimes you can look out into an audience and people's heads are down and they're on their phones or iPads or even laptops in front of them. But as a speaker, you have to remember that some people take notes that way. Some people are texting, some people are writing their grocery list, but some people are taking notes. And also people can multitask. Remember I said you have about 6 seconds to talk about a slide. So you can multitask, you can hear what I'm saying and do your grocery list at the same time. But as a speaker, you don't want to be frustrated by that. Now if you look out of the audience and you see someone in pre-coma mode like this guy is on the screen, that can be a little discouraging. But don't be discouraged by people using electronic devices. Give them the benefit of the doubt and hope that they're taking notes and not playing Candy Crush. If you see someone in coma mode, you can change your tone and volume and even the speed that you're presenting data or information. That can help wake things up. And then I put in there about adding funnies. Funnies or cartoons or jokes in their PowerPoint can lighten things up. They can keep people's attention onto a presentation, but they can also be distracting if you have too many. So you don't want every slide to have a joke or a cartoon on it, because then it gets a little childish and a little immature. So put them in strategically to keep people's attention, but not to be distracting. All right, we're going to go a little bit more into data. We have about 10 minutes here. We're going to give you a scenario. St. Elsewhere Hospital is tracking timeliness of transfer for transfer out patients. So we had 30 patients transferred out from St. Elsewhere. The average time of the transfer out was 293 minutes. This is something that we all track frequently at our trauma centers, the amount of minutes till we get a patient out of our center if we're transferring them to another trauma center. So here's a graph, a simple bar graph that shows our benchmark goal is 180 minutes. St. Elsewhere's average is 293 minutes. And that's not good. We don't want it to be as high. But I would challenge you to look at your PI data and drill down on that data. This is the worst slide of the whole presentation because it takes you back to statistics in nursing school or in college when you had to learn about mean, median, mode, range, and outliers. And you thought when you were sitting in statistics, when am I ever going to use this information? Well, here it comes back to haunt you again. So remember that the mean is really the average of your data. The median is the middle number. If you put them all in a line, the number in the middle. The mode is a number that occurs most often. There's a great example of not reading my slide because I put my picture right over my word. The range is the difference between the lowest and the highest number, and the outliers are just things that mess things up. So I'm going to give you an example. We talk about St. Elsewhere having 30 patients transferred out. This is in the blue here are all the number of minutes for all of those 30 patients that were transferred out last year. If I just give you that raw data, it is what it is. It's just simple statistic data graph on a list. However, if I put them in order from the smallest to the biggest, all 30 numbers on the smallest to biggest, my mean, which is that average, the average of all my numbers was 293 minutes. The median, which is the middle of the list. So if there's 30, I would go to 15. 15 is in the middle. That's my median is 23 minutes. The mode is the number that occurred most often, is 28 minutes, and the range is the highest number minus the lowest number. If you have a really big range like we have here, sorry about that, if we have a very big range like we have here, that tells you that you have outliers in your data set, and you need to look at them and figure out what's going on. For example, this is patients that are transferred out. How can you get a patient truly in your hospital and transferred out in 4 minutes? So I would venture to say that those are outliers and probably something got messed up there. In addition, 6,575 minutes is also very long. So if you take out the outliers, a wide range means that you have outliers that are messing up your data. The median and mode, the closer they are to each other, the better indication of what your true number is. So this median and mode are very, very close, which means our actual number of the most frequently average of minutes is somewhere in between 23 and 28. So if we take out those outliers from the range, we take out the outliers, now our true modified average is 82 minutes, which is much better than that 290 that we talked about before. I believe this is our last interactive poll. What type of chart graph would you use to present the data? So if we're going to present the data of the number of minutes to send our patient out in, average number of minutes, would you do that in a table, a pie graph, a line graph, a bar graph, or a scatter graph, scatter plot? Interactive poll. What type of chart or graph would you utilize to present this data? A table or a list, a pie chart, a line graph, a bar graph, or a scatter plot? Cody, what do we have? Cody, are you there?
I'm sorry, I had it on mute. We're at about 60% vote right now. I'm sorry. I'm going to try to get about 7%. So give them a few more seconds.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
We made it to 70%. 7% said a table or a list. 7% also said a pie chart. 37% said a line graph, and 50% said a bar graph.
All right. So I'm going to show you all of those examples, how they would come out in a chart. If you would do a simple table list, this would be what your benchmark was, what your raw data showed, and what your modified data showed. It does get your point across. However, the problem with this is that you have to interpret that data. It's hard to look at that, and your mind has to figure out that your raw data and your benchmark are very different, but you don't really have a relationship between the two. So I would not recommend a table or a list for this data. A pie chart, the problem is that the relationship to the whole doesn't mean anything. You know that your raw data is bigger, but you have no simple statistics with it. Again, here's an example of you have plenty of room on your pie to label those pieces, so I would pull the legend up and place them right on the pie graph there. But again, this can get your information out, but doesn't really show the relationship to each other. Your line graph, which would show the same thing, again, it's giving you a false interpretation of the data because it insinuates that something happened to make it go down. And what happened was you took and you did modifications to your data, but it's really not a comparison over a length of time. So I wouldn't recommend a line graph. This is the bar graph. I think this is the one that shows it the best. It shows, again, we're using green to highlight good, that our 82 minutes modified average is what we were going for there. I would challenge you to take this data, if you are looking at transfer out data, and continue to drill down. So, oh, I'm sorry, let me just show you this. This is the same bar graph, spread out a little bit different. Let me show you before and after. You could put a star right on your box to show people this is where you want your attention to go to and label it modified average. That works nice. I would tell you to continue to drill down on those. We're not going to go through this exercise. It'll be in your slides for the future, but you can look at all of those delays of transfer out and break them down into categories. Here's a pie graph for the number of patients that were waiting more than 3 hours. Why were they waiting? You can also put it in a bar graph to talk about the number of minutes for each kind of delay. So continue to drill down on data. For the last couple of minutes here, we're going to take some big PI categories and give you some examples of how to drill down on that data. Again, we're not going to go through each one of these and give you examples. This is just broad categories for you to think and challenge yourself as you're looking through your own PI program. So if you're looking at an EMS scene time greater than 20 minutes, I would tell you to filter out your outliers of your data for entrapment, BLS, ALS helicopter rendezvous. You can silo them in a bar graph by minutes because you really want to know how many were there close to 20 minutes and how many were there very long. You could also silo them out according to their injury severity score and death to show that the patients who are truly the sickest aren't spending that much time on scene. It's a great way to get to drill down on that data. Under and over triage is the Krabari grid. You're going to have to get comfortable with this grid because it's part of the new ACS Orange Book and requirements to report out on under and over triage. However, we all know it doesn't give the full description of under and over triage, so we give you lots of examples here of how to drill down on those kind of categories. Again, we're not going through all these. You do get a copy of the slides, so it'll list them there. And this is a list of things to drill down for over triage as well. Those of you who are looking at ED vital sign compliance, you can look at your trauma team activation compliance versus ED compliance. That's a great one to drill down to. Look at your vital sign compliance on patients that are alive or dead, for example. Great way to drill down on that data. Trauma team attending response to your activation. Again, things that you can silo out and look at your data. Look at, was it weather related? How many times were they late because of weather or things like that? Glasgow Coma scale, less than 14 without a CAT scan of the head. Obviously, if you're dead on arrival, you're not getting a CAT scan. You can eliminate some of those outliers from your data. Time to operative procedure, there's ways to drill down on those kind of PI opportunities. Admission to non-surgical service, also ways to drill down. Clinical guideline compliance, a lot of us are struggling with this. You have to look at your clinical guidelines and look at ways to show compliance with those. So massive transfusion, for example, you can drill down on the time it takes to get to round 2. A lot of us have round 1 on AMTP down well, but round 2 is a little more confusing. And then the last category that you can drill down on is deaths. And again, silo them out into preventability, death on arrival, withdrawal of care, admitting service, and mechanism of injury. Just ways that you can look at the data, put it in graphs, and break it down to better demonstrate PI outcomes. That's my presentation. I know we took the whole hour. If you have questions that you can submit to Cody, he will forward them to me, and I'll be happy to answer them to you in an email as well. Otherwise, you'll get a follow-up email from Kim and STN at the end of the presentation.
Thank you, Amy. And again, send any questions you may have to info@traumanurses.org, and I'll send those to Amy for her to answer. And again, this webinar was recorded and will be placed on the STN website by the end of the week. Thank you and have a great day.